there's no threat of Karl sinking deeper into any morass. He does a great job for the Australian Chesterton Society. He's been the president now for 11 years, which is great, succeeding the late Tony Evans, who passed away recently, as Karl mentioned. Tony founded the Society 25 years ago. Since 2014, Karl has also edited the quarterly newsletter The Defendant, which most of us get and enjoy, I imagine. I read mine from cover to cover and share it with a couple of friends. Karl is allegedly now in retirement, although Virginia might think that his work on Chesterton would suggest otherwise. He seems as busy as ever. His long career spanned librarianship. He was the university librarian at the New England University in Armidale, which is his hometown, for 16 years. And he was involved intimately in the development of an independent Catholic tertiary institution, which we're now enjoying some of the facilities of, Campion College. For more than 50 years, Karl has engaged in freelance writing and speaking. His feature articles and book reviews on subjects of religion and culture, especially literature, history and education, have been published in newspapers and journals, not only in Australia, but also the United States, Canada, South America, England, and most recently in the Czech Republic. He's also published various biographical booklets, including one on Chesterton in 1974, which has been republished in 2008 in London, and on the historian Christopher Dawson, which is for sale at the book sale outside. Since 2007, he has organised conferences of the Australian Chesterton Society here at Campion College, and he has spoken overseas at conferences as well. For example, in August at the American Chesterton Society in Florida, where he gave a presentation on Chesterton and Australia. Chesterton didn't have a great love for Australia, did he? That's perhaps his main argument against him being a saint. Another one, yes. Today, Karl will be speaking on the innocence of Father Chesterton. So we welcome him to the stage.
Thanks very much, Gary, for that. I just realised as the Czech Republic was mentioned, I got an email a couple of years ago from, fortunately in English, from a gentleman who's the editor of a journal in Prague, and he asked if he could translate an article I'd written, which was originally a paper here on the spirituality of G.K. Chesterton. It was published in the Chesterton Review. And then he sent me a copy of the journal in which it appeared subsequently, and it was all, of course, not in English, and I presumed it was faithfully translated. But I wrote back to him a number of times, not only to thank him, but to ask if he might report on Chesterton in the Czech Republic. And I thought at one stage, but I thought this would go over completely wrongly. I would write to my Czech mate, and then Virginia, no. So I hear from the gallery, I hear all sorts of protests. So I didn't. But he still didn't answer. So. But anyhow, let me begin, ladies and gentlemen, with the title of this paper, The Innocence of Father Chesterton, and try to unpack it, noting the key themes I'd like to explore with you this morning. The title emphasises both innocence and father, and it's based on the title, as many of you would know, of the first collected edition of the Father Brown stories, The Innocence of Father Brown. Book there. It was published in 1911. Why would Chesterton highlight the innocence of Father Brown? And what did he mean by innocence, given how conscious he was of the fallen nature of all human beings, including priests? In our time, of course, tragically, we're even more acutely conscious of the fallen nature of priests, though I'd hope that the lapses of certain priests do not give rise to any presumption of lay superiority, of the superior moral condition of lay people. But Innocence did hold a profound meaning for Chesterton, and I'd like to focus on this dimension of his life and his character and link it with his insight into the nature of childhood and his love of children. I'll also explore how deeply Christian his understanding was, how reflective it was of Christ's attitude to childhood. Let me mention a couple of incidents that I think capture the response that Chesterton had to children, the ways in which children tugged at his heartstrings. One occasion was when he was travelling to give a lecture. He planned to prepare his talk in the train, but he spent the journey playing with children in the compartment. The father of the children had just suffered the loss of his wife, and he thanked Chesterton at the end of the journey for entertaining the children during the trip. On another occasion, he was at a party with children, and a mother, conscious of Chesterton's literary reputation, asked her child when he came back home if Mr. Chesterton had been very clever. And the child replied, "Yes, Mum, you should see him catch buns in his mouth." Well, without doubt, Chesterton's sense of children is very much bound up with his own experience of childhood, which was abundantly happy. In his autobiography, only published several months after his death in 1936, Chesterton recalls not only various incidents from his childhood, but also the thoughts and feelings which a child experiences. He displays a deep, intuitive understanding of the way a child forms his picture of the world. As the British literary critic John Gross once commented, the opening chapters of Chesterton's autobiography, Gross said, and I quote, are littered with sound observations and shrewd distinctions which are still worth pondering, notably in connection with the nature of play and the difference between imagination and illusion. End of quote. In her biography of Chesterton, Maisie Ward notes that even as a schoolboy, he had an ardent love of children. In his earliest writings, he showed a profound affinity with childhood that he never lost. As he wrote in an early essay, I quote, "Happy is he," said Chesterton, "who still loves something he loved in the nursery. He has not been broken in two by time. He is not two men, but one, and has saved not only his soul, but his life." Now, by the time Chesterton reached his early 20s, his imagination was deeply enlivened and strengthened by his affection for children. He wrote a notebook at this time, and it was a way of recording his developing philosophy of life. And he wrote in that notebook in the form of a poem, and I quote, "Sunlight in a child's hair. It is like the kiss of Christ upon all children. I blessed the child and hoped the blessing would go with him and never leave him." Here we can see, I think, an early sign of one of Chesterton's deepest intuitions, connecting the Christian belief in God becoming man, the incarnation of Christ, with the experience of a little child. Now, nearly 30 years later, in a mature work, The Everlasting Man, that was published in 1925, he devoted a chapter to what he called the God in the cave. And he outlined the significance of God as a child in these terms. "Any agnostic or atheist," said Chesterton, "whose childhood has known a real Christmas, has ever afterwards, whether he likes it or not, an association in his mind between two ideas that most of mankind must regard as remote from each other. The idea of a baby and the idea of unknown strength that sustains the stars. His instincts and imagination can still connect them, when his reason can no longer see the need of the connection. For him there will always be some savour of religion about the mere picture of a mother and a baby, some hint of mercy and softening about the mere mention of the dreadful name of God. So in his picture of reality, Chesterton linked these two apparently unconnected, even opposing ideas: God and a child, divinity and infancy, omnipotence and powerlessness. As he once wrote, Bethlehem is emphatically a place where extremes meet, and perhaps he implied are reconciled in a supreme paradox. Very Chestertonian. It's the birthplace, Bethlehem, of the divine child, Christ, at once human and divine, at once powerless and all-powerful. The British theologian John Milbank has pointed out that Christian teaching turns around the traditional approach to pedagogy. It proposes the child as the teacher of the adult. God becomes incarnate as a child, and as a child, he instructs the learned, teaching the elders in the temple. Now, as we know, the Gospels repeatedly show the singular importance and value that Christ attached to childhood. On the celebrated occasion when children were brought to him, but then turned away by the disciples, Christ called them back. And he said, "Let the little children come to me and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs." In another part of the Gospels, Christ confronts his disciples who are discussing which was the greatest among them. He speaks of not being the first, but rather the last, of being a servant of all. He sets a little child in front of the 12, and he says, "Anyone who welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me." On another occasion, after Christ had expanded his community of disciples as he made his way to Jerusalem for his crucifixion, to face that, he acknowledged yet again the need for being childlike. "I bless you, Father," he said, "for hiding these things from the learned and the clever and revealing them to mere children." Well, this is a subtle rebuke, if it can be described as that, of intellectual pride, and a huge antidote to it, and perhaps accounts for the small number of intellectuals to be found among the saints. It also helps to explain why St. Thomas Aquinas thought at the close of his life that all he had written was so much straw. One of the last books of the Swiss theologian, Hans-Urs von Balthasar, explored the profound meaning of Christ's call that we become like little children. The book was entitled "Unless You Become Like This Child," published in the year 1988 of Balthasar's death. And it reflected on the condition of spiritual childhood to which we all are called, the life of childlikeness, by which we will see that our supposed condition of adulthood, recognised as apparently successful and self-sufficient, is at odds with our calling to be children of God, which is to be open to an eternal destiny rather than bound by this earthly life, dependent on God's wisdom and mercy rather than our own ambitions and achievements and entrenched pride. Let me try to identify the qualities of childhood that most appeal to Chesterton. We can assume to Christ as well, given his exaltation of children as the model of those aspiring to heaven. They're qualities I think we can all appreciate, especially if, like Virginia and myself, and no doubt many of you, have the double blessing of being grandparents as well as parents. What are the distinctive qualities of childhood? There's such things, I think, as a sense of wonder at creation, the constantly manifested realities of creation, and yet also its mysteries. A natural honesty and innocence. Children haven't yet learned to dissemble, to be one way and act another. A simplicity of spirit, a humility of heart, a deep sense of dependence, a capacity to live acceptingly in the present. These are among the most vital qualities of childhood. They tend to fade as the years pass and the trials and betrayals of life take their toll. Yet Christ's statements would imply that upon the recovery and the nurturing of these qualities rests our salvation. In other words, a childlike attitude, not a childish attitude, but a childlike one, is a central element in our approach to life and to our relationship with God. I think this distinction between childlike and childish is fundamental, and it should guard against any misunderstanding or false romanticism about childhood, which might encourage a certain cult of childhood that represents, I think, the very opposite of what Chesterton is saying. That is, a retreat or a sheltering from the hard realities and responsibilities of adult life, and a readiness to avoid immaturity or lapse back into it and justify bad behaviour. One of the ironies of our time, I think, is the extent to which adults can be excused for acting childishly, especially if, in an atmosphere heightened by identity politics at present, they're seen as part of a protected group that's beyond criticism, related to gender or race or some other category. One thinks of the recent controversy surrounding Serena Williams in the US Tennis Open, or the juvenile door-banging tactics used by protesters against certain speakers on university campuses because their political views are judged to be too incorrect to be heard. Several years ago, the film critic of the New York Times, A.O. Scott, analysed what he saw as a major cultural shift in present-day movies and TV series, what he called the death of adulthood in American culture, and particularly the death of manhood, the emasculated male. Scott thought that present-day culture now endorsed a permanent childishness, almost the price to be paid for our modern worship of youthfulness. It promoted, he said, an essentially juvenile vision of the world, and this was making traditional adulthood intellectually untenable, he thought, to the point where, as he put it, nobody knows how to be a grown up anymore. Scott cited a TV period drama, Mad Men, about the characters in a New York City advertising agency in the 1960s, which illustrated the collapse of male authority in the culture, leading to declining respect for the qualities of masculinity. The series Mad Men was among the movies and TV series of our time which favour what Scott called adolescent heroism and, he said, comedies of arrested development. Now, as movie critic for the New York Times, Scott was unsurprisingly quite ambivalent about these changes. He applauded the demise of what he called patriarchal authority, and he believed that the defeat of this authority had liberated women and created a freer and more open society. He shrank from the sense of male entitlement that had underpinned that authority, though he didn't mention, it's fair to say, that this went with a sense of male responsibility traditionally, a sense of male loyalty and devotion for family, for society, and for women. But Scott acknowledged that the change had effectively, as he put it, killed off all the grown-ups. It has had an infantilising effect on our culture. The current crop of TV's stock characters in sitcoms like Broad City, The Simpsons and Bob's Burger are people who are disaffected. In Scott's words, each wallows in his own immaturity. Now, these series abound in desperately sad individuals and dysfunctional families, in which the search for adulthood is conceived, in Scott's words, as the state of being forever young. And grown-ups no longer feel any compulsion, as Scott put it, to put away childish things. It's almost an echo of the words of St. Paul. When I was a child, I spoke and thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. The death of adulthood did not happen suddenly, Scott thought, and it was ushered in by the emergence of characters who are both bad and sad. We think of such long-running TV series as The Sopranos, which the Australian sociologist John Karl has argued is symbolic of the cultural temper of our times, in which the stability of a culture founded on firm beliefs, particularly Christian beliefs about life and the afterlife, is giving way to one that curiously and childishly tries to ignore any ultimate questions of purpose and meaning. It cannot satisfy the spiritual longings of its people, nor appease its spiritual torments. Spiritual longings, which are disguised and distracted by the obsessive allurements of a consumerist culture, and spiritual torments, which find expression in physical and psychological addictions and self-destructive behaviour of one kind or another. The French theologian Cardinal Jean Deniou reflected in the 1960s in what I think is a brilliant little book, Prayer as a Political Problem. He said a culture, which he crystallised in the book as a city, that does not provide for the spiritual yearnings of adoration and contemplation and prayer for its people is an inhuman culture. It is not fit for human beings. It excludes a fundamental human need and so fails to fulfil its role as a culture. Well, just to refer and reflect further briefly on The Sopranos, the main characters, some of you may be familiar with this series, is a mafia mobster, Tony Soprano. I naturally thought this was about musicians when I first heard the title, but was soon disabused of that. Anyhow, Soprano's seemingly powerful and in control of his life, and yet he is besieged by insecurities. He suffers panic attacks, despite his presiding over a mafia network in New Jersey. The Sopranos illustrates the profound cultural change that A.O. Scott explores. And that is not just a presumed progress from oppression to liberation, but also a shift from family solidity to individual identity and insecurity. Family solidity that recognised the value of a child being allowed to be a child and not a prematurely sexualised adult, and the importance of maturing without losing the enduring qualities of childhood. I think The Sopranos could be seen as exemplifying the agony of a culture that aspires to adulthood by experiencing the loss of childhood. In the popular imagination of our time, a Western cowboy hero such as John Wayne, sure of his identity as a man, has been succeeded by an urban gangster, Tony Soprano, abounding in deep insecurities despite his apparent power. Soprano is a character at once detestable and enticing, who's plagued by anxieties arising from a fearful childhood, a key factor in his psychological unwinding. He's only managed to become an adult by jettisoning his essential nature as a child of God. If we look at Christian literature over the centuries, we can find examples of this distinction between childlike and childish. In Dante's Paradiso, for example, Beatrice, the guide of Dante, calls him in the second canto a baby for his incomprehension about heaven. At last year's Chesterton conference, Stephen McInerney, Campion lecturer here, who's currently on secondment to the Ramsay Centre in Sydney, Stephen pointed out that this has a comment of Beatrice's has a twofold nature. It suggests mockery, but it's not just mockery. It's also a compliment, for it highlights that Dante has, in fact, become like a little child in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. Chesterton, I think, recognised this deeply again in an early essay, where he explicitly links the idea of childhood with the idea of fatherhood, which is what I must say prompted the title of this paper, The Innocence of Father Chesterton. Chesterton wrote in this early essay, "Christianity seeks after God," he said, "with the most elementary passion it can find, the craving for a father, the hunger that is as old as the hills. It turns the whole cry of a lost universe into the cry of a lost child." Very telling line, I think. It turns the whole cry of a lost universe into the cry of a lost child. Well, I'd like to turn now to another essay Chesterton wrote on children, again in his early years, 1901, beginning of his writing career. It's called In Defence of Baby Worship, and it forms a chapter in the first book of essays, The Defendant, as it's called. Here he presents a paradoxical defence of such things that he had found in the culture were regarded as indefensible. So he wrote essays in defence of rash vows, in defence of penny dreadfuls, in defence of skeletons, and in defence of nonsense. Not anti-sense, but nonsense. It was the beginning of a long and noble struggle, I think, on his part to champion ideas and values that were ignored or derided in his time. I'd like to note just a couple of the themes that Chesterton explored in this early essay. He begins by trying to capture what he sees as the essential qualities of children. That they are, first, he said, very serious, and secondly, that they are, as a result, very happy. They are jolly, he says, with the completeness which is possible only in the absence of humour. They have what Chesterton calls gravity. The gravity, he says, of astonishment at the universe, of seeing the world with utterly fresh eyes, and holding within their heads a new universe. He describes it as this: a new system of stars, new grass, new cities, a new sea. If only we could see the stars as a child sees them, observes Chesterton, we should need no other apocalypse, no other revelation. Well, Chesterton himself exemplified, as we know throughout his life and his writings, this freshness of vision, a singular ability to see things as they are, unclouded by familiarity, undistorted by ideology. It was, as we've noted, in his own childhood that he received this gift of appreciation, the appreciation of primary realities. He once put it this way: nearly all the best and most precious things in the universe you can get for a halfpenny. I make an exception, of course, of the sun, the moon, the earth, people, stars, thunderstorms, and such trifles. You can get them for nothing. So what Chesterton valued instinctively as a child, such fundamental things as the experience of the concrete and the commonplace, the personality of the small in comparison with the rootlessly large, what he valued instinctively as a child, he came to value intellectually as an adult. This was a way in which he developed towards maturity. In his autobiography, he wrote, I quote, "If anybody chooses to say that I have founded all my social philosophy on the antics of a baby, I am quite satisfied to bow and smile." There's a second theme in this early essay of Chesterton's on baby worship that I'd like to underline, and that is his deep sense of the spiritual meaning and significance of children. Chesterton saw childhood as a remarkable image of weakness of nature and unmistakable helplessness, combined with profound spiritual power and impressiveness, supplied not just by natural qualities, but by supernatural gifts. He put it in his essay in defence of baby worship in this way: "The very smallness of children," he said, "makes it possible to regard them as marvels. I doubt if any one of any tenderness or imagination can see the hand of a child and not be a little frightened of it. It is awful to think of the essential human energy moving so tiny a thing. It is like imagining that human nature could live in the wing of a butterfly or the leaf of a tree. When we look upon lives so human and yet so small, we feel as if we ourselves were enlarged to an embarrassing bigness of stature." Now, his insights into the spiritual importance of childhood find a remarkable echo, I think, in the writings of certain French Catholic writers of the same era. The novelist Georges Bernanos, for example, the author of Diary of a Country Priest, many other books, emphasised the continuing significance of childhood in the life of the adult. In the eyes of Bernanos, as the British critic Peter Hepplethwaite once noted, childhood was an image of the supernatural condition. It was the reflection of a more or less instinctive right relationship to God. An adult possesses hope insofar as he has preserved something of childhood and struggles to restore and enhance its qualities. The heroine in one of his novels, Chantal de Clergerie, remarks, "It seems to me," she had confided to the priest, Abbé Senabre, one day, "that it's possible to act like an adult, keeping up one's little place in the world, defending one's legitimate interests, and at the same time view the essential elementary things, joy, sorrow, death, with the eyes of a child." The theologian John Milbank, whom I quoted before, makes a similar point when discussing the 19th century Scottish author George MacDonald. Chesterton cherished a great admiration for George MacDonald, acknowledging the deep impact on him in his early life of one of MacDonald's fantasy novels. And John Milbank reflects on a fairy story of MacDonald's entitled The Light Princess. He points out that the love between the princess and the prince is dependent on the princess becoming a child, recapturing the vision of childhood in order to become a full adult. The experience of maturing, Milbank argues, is actually an event within childhood. Childhood, therefore, is not something that we grow out of, it is something we grow into. Bernanos held a similar view. He thought the values enshrined in childhood still call to us from the future. They are a sign, a faint intimation of communion with God. In his final book, The Carmelites, a play about a community of nuns martyred during the French Revolution, Bernanos cast the meaning of a religious vocation in terms of the rediscovery of childhood values. There's a prioress in the play, and she compares the prayer of a shepherd boy, which is offered spontaneously as he tends his flock, with the absorption in prayer that should distinguish the life of the nun. This is what the prioress says in the play. What a little shepherd boy does from time to time, and on an impulse of the heart, it is our duty to do both day and night. Not that we have any reason to suppose that our prayers are better than his, but on the contrary, that simplicity of spirit, that sweet surrender to the divine majesty, which in him is the inspiration of a moment, a true act of grace, and as though the flooding illumination of genius, we must devote our lives to acquiring or of finding again, for it is one of the gifts of childhood. Once we have left those behind us, we have to suffer for a very long time before entering them again. Just as when the long night is over, we find the dawn once more. Another French Catholic author with a profound grasp of childhood, I think, was the poet Charles Beguine. He was killed in 1914 in one of the first battles of World War I. He was very conscious of the links between childhood and innocence. He thought that innocence was not the absence of experience. It was not a naive refusal to accept the experience of the world and deal with reality. Rather the opposite. It is innocence, he said, that is full, and experience that is empty. It is the innocence that wins, and experience that loses. Beguine saw that innocence is not really a lost condition from the past, but a future hope. It beckons to us from the future. It is innocence that grows, Beguine said, an experience that wanes. So the sense we have very deeply in Beguine and Bernanos, as in Chesterton, is not of living in a past childhood, but of a past childhood living in us. It's not a condition of futile escape or naive nostalgia. It's a condition of promise, calling out to us, a condition of hope, a sign of and a pathway to salvation. So there's this fundamental integrity between our past and our future that's suggested right through these thoughts, I think. In 1909, Chesterton moved to Beaconsfield, a small town outside of London on the road to Oxford, and he developed there a special friendship with the local children, entertaining them in company with his wife Frances, as Nancy will be talking about most fascinatingly later in the conference, entertaining them individually and in groups. Apart from catching buns in his mouth, a particular favourite of Chesterton's was his sword stick, which fascinated children as he waved it about. He would draw it out of a decorated cane, walking stick, and lunge at nearby bushes. He devised for the children quite elaborate games, and the children attending these spectacles would, as one biographer has written, scream with delight at such games, dancing around the huge Gilbert as though he were a never-ending source of fun and amusement. Chesterton welcomed with delight the arrival of his friends' children into the world, an attitude that must have been tinged, of course, with a certain heartache after his and his wife's inability to have children of their own. Well, let me conclude these reflections about Chesterton's attitude to children with a poignant expression of his championing of childhood itself. His first published books consisted of poems, not prose works or pieces of journalism. And in his first volume of collected poems, he imagines with remarkable prescience the life of an unborn baby. The baby itself is the voice of the poem, gives expression to the sentiments of wonder and gratitude. I'd like to quote three of its stanzas, particularly the last two, I think very touching ones. In dark I lie, dreaming that there are great eyes, cold or kind, and twisted streets, and silent doors, and living men behind. I think that if they gave me leave within the world to stand, I would be good through all the day I spent in fairyland. They should not hear a word from me of selfishness or scorn. If only I could find the door, if only I were born. Well, let me turn finally today to a second important aspect of Chesterton's Innocence, and that is his lifelong love of fairy tales. We might understandably think that fairy tales are for the very young and that we grow out of them as we get older. But Chesterton saw them as bound up deeply with our sense of mystery and enchantment, and he deplored the way in which the culture of his time, and even more, I suppose, of our time, is full of disenchantment and despair. We think of other authors such as Tolkien and his imaginative works like Lord of the Rings, and C.S. Lewis with his books for children, notably the Chronicles of Narnia, which have both been turned into a series of movies. Narnia, like Tolkien's world, is not a fantasy that is devoid or destructive of reality. It's an imaginative recreation of our world, emphasising the qualities that inspire and ennoble us rather than drag us down. To elaborate on Chesterton's great love of fairy tales, the first and most crucial point is that he thought they were real. They were not a product of fantasy. They were all about reality. They do not represent an indulgence in make-believe, he thought. On the contrary, they contain what Chesterton called the deepest truth of the earth, the real record of men's feeling for things. Fairy tales are full of moral truths, so that, for example, Beauty and the Beast contains, Chesterton said, the eternal and essential truth that until we love a thing in all its ugliness, we cannot make it beautiful. In his great work, Orthodoxy, he devotes an entire chapter, The Ethics of Elfland, to showing how fairy tales supplied his earliest intellectual formation. My first and last philosophy, he wrote, that which I believe in with unbroken certainty, I learnt in the nursery. Fairyland for him was the sunny country of common sense. The sunny country of common sense. And fairy tales the source of a sound philosophy of life. In another place, he explains that the core of fairy tales is also the core of ethics. That peace and happiness, he said, can only exist on some condition. That all happiness hangs on one thin veto. All positive joy depends on one negative. That if one does the thing forbidden, one imperils all the things provided. And he went on to illustrate the many fundamental truths revealed in fairy tales. Cinderella, he said, may have a dress woven on supernatural looms and blazing with unearthly brilliance, but she must be back when the clock strikes 12. A girl is given a box on condition she does not open it. She opens it, and all the evils of this world rush out at her. A man and woman are put in a garden on condition they do not eat one fruit. They eat it and lose their joy in all the fruits of the earth. As you may recall, earlier this year, the state government of Victoria announced that it would be encouraging children to act as fairy tale detectives so that they can identify gendered messages in fairy tales. What a contrast with Chesterton's appreciation of fairy tales. He focused on the principal truths about life that are to be discovered there. He was, of course, aware that some people thought fairy tales were bad for children. On one occasion, for example, a lady wrote to him to say that it was cruel to tell children such tales, as it frightened them. Chesterton's response was that this misunderstands the nature of children. If they are denied stories about scary mythical creatures like goblins, they will simply conjure them up for themselves. Children are alarmed at this world, Chesterton argued, because it is a very alarming place. Their fear does not come from fairy tales. It comes from what Chesterton calls the universe of the soul. He went on to explain how fairy tales fill out the child's understanding of reality. I quote, "Fairy tales do not give the child the idea of the evil or the ugly. That is in the child already, because it is in the world already. Fairy tales do not give a child his first idea of bogey, something that causes fear or worry." I first read this, I thought, he's not lapsing into golf, surely he's got his first idea of bogey, but it isn't, as you would know better than me, ladies and gentlemen. Fairy tales do not give a child his first idea of bogey. What fairy tales give the child is his first clear idea of the possible defeat of bogey. The baby has known the dragon intimately ever since he had an imagination. What the fairy tale provides for him is a St. George to kill the dragon. The Victorian government's concern about the damaging effects of fairy tales bears out in a peculiar and even perverse way Chesterton's high appreciation of such childhood literature. The government is only pursuing such programs of social engineering because it recognises the powerful impact that fairy tales can have on the very young. What a pity it didn't consult Chesterton's writings on the subject and spend some time in the sunny country of common sense and avoid the embarrassment of a monumental missing of the point. Well, to conclude where we began, and that is the title of this paper based on the innocence of Father Brown. What did Chesterton mean when he highlighted the innocence of Father Brown? Is he simply a rather bumbling, eccentric priest who seems by accident to identify the criminal? Well, I think as Dale Orquist, the president of the American Chesterton Society, has put it very succinctly, Father Brown solves crimes for two fundamental reasons. Firstly, he gets inside not only of the criminal's mind, but also the criminal's heart. He gets inside of the criminal as a fellow human being, relying neither on modern technology or even the scientific accumulation and analysis of clues. As is made clear in one of the Father Brown stories, The Hammer of God, when the priest is confronted by a questioner, "How do you know all this?" the man cried. "Are you a devil?" "I am a man," answered Father Brown gravely, "and therefore have all devils in my heart." And secondly, Father Brown penetrates the human heart by appearing so unworldly, so ordinary and innocent, so like a child at times, that he is never suspected of being so perceptive and so penetrating, so in touch with reality. He catches a criminal by surprise. There is perhaps something of the historical character of the holy fool, or fool for God, about Father Brown, one who is prepared to appear a fool because of his simple and straightforward imitation of Christ, a person for whom, in St. Paul's words, the foolishness of God is greater than the wisdom of men. So divine wisdom especially is connected with human innocence, especially the innocence of the child. So the innocence of Father Brown, I think, is the innocence of Chesterton. Not a state of naivety or avoidance of experience, but a state that accepts yet transcends experience. Not simply a condition of the past, but a call of the future. A cry for God that only he can answer when he calls us home. Thank you very much.